Hello and welcome to FEMA Region 10's webinar on the National Flood Insurance Program and the Puget Sound Biological Opinion. My name is Scott Van Hoff.
And I'm Justin Craven.
This webinar is specifically for Door 3 or permit-by-permit communities. These are communities that ensure compliance through the review of habitat assessments for most projects in the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. Today we will briefly touch on some basic National Flood Insurance Program information and primarily focus on permit-by-permit or Door 3 method of complying with the Puget Sound Biological Opinion. Today we will be speaking on these main topics. We are going to touch on some basic NFIP standards and definitions, but this webinar is intended to breeze past most of the basics and dive specifically into the biological opinion and FEMA's ESA compliance process. The NFIP is a unique federal program in that it operates through mutual agreement with local governments, where FEMA agrees to make flood insurance available within a community when that community agrees to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations that meet or exceed the NFIP minimum standards. The NFIP relates to the floodplain or Special Flood Hazard Area, SFHA for short. This area is also called the 1% chance or greater floodplain, and commonly referred to as the 100-year floodplain or simply the floodplain. These are all the same thing in the NFIP. We're trying to get away from calling this area the 100-year floodplain because it misrepresents the risk in that every year there is a 1% chance of a flood of this size or greater happening. Also, it is important to understand the NFIP is a voluntary program that is based on minimum standards, and communities may choose to have local ordinances that exceed the NFIP minimum standards, which FEMA encourages. This is the infamous NFIP three-legged stool, which mysteriously looks a lot like a four-legged stool. But anyway, the NFIP has three fundamental prongs necessary for the program to function: hazard identification, floodplain management, and flood insurance. These three things are held together by regulations, compliance, and insurance rating. Together, these elements are the foundation of the National Flood Insurance Program. The federal role in the NFIP includes identifying the risk in partnership with local communities, mapping, establishing minimum standards, providing flood insurance coverage, overseeing implementation and enforcement of the NFIP, and disaster response and recovery. The state role involves establishing state codes. They help provide NFIP technical assistance to local communities, developers, licensed professionals, and the public. The state also is contracted by FEMA to help document floodplain management activities. They also provide disaster mitigation assistance and also manage hazard mitigation grant programs. The local communities have a large role. They are where the rubber meets the road for the NFIP. They do all of these things listed here. Of special note is that the locals review and issue permits and implement their own floodplain management regulations. The private sector also plays an important role in this program, as you can see here. And for what we are talking about today, private biological consultants are a huge part of this program. Flood insurance rate maps, also known as FIRMs, show the flood risk, and it is important to remember that these are an insurance rating tool, hence the name Flood Insurance Rate Map, but they are now used for many other purposes, sometimes unintended purposes.
So that was the intro to the NFIP. We said it was brief. Now, given FEMA is an acronym, it is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Our agency uses a dizzying number of acronyms, and we will do our best to avoid those acronyms. That said, these are a few terms that we'll use often that you should know. NIMS is the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is a division of NOAA Fisheries and responsible for the stewardship and management of the nation's living marine resources and their habitat. The BO, or BIOP, is the biological opinion on the implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program in Puget Sound. And within that BIOP is a reasonable and prudent alternative, or RPA, which was written by NIMS to FEMA and describes ways that FEMA needs to change implementation of the NFIP in order for the NFIP to be compliant with the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. One of the most fundamental items for the NFIP is the definition of development as found in Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations and shown here. Please note that this definition of development is applicable to anything related to the NFIP, and often this definition differs from a local jurisdiction's definition of development used for building and some other land use ordinances. But for work in the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA, this is the definition of development that needs to be used. So what are we trying to accomplish here? Well, federal agencies, along with everybody, must comply with the ESA, and Section 7 of the Act specifically requires FEMA, as a federal agency, to consult with NIMS to ensure our actions do not contribute to the decline of ESA-listed species. So what does this mean for communities that choose to participate in the NFIP and the people that live in these communities? Well, it means that things are changing. The NFIP has been around since 1968, which results in some outdated habits and expectations. For a long time, the program has required us to address the beneficial functions that floodplains perform. We believe we are currently in the middle of a paradigm shift that changes how we look at development in floodplains as it relates to the functions and values these frequently flooded areas perform that support listed species. If you've asked yourself, why is the Puget Sound being singled out? This map shows that we are not alone with respect to these biops. In 1997, Florida received a biological opinion that addressed impacts to the key deer, a terrestrial species, which changed how the NFIP was implemented in some counties of Florida. You can also see there are 3 states currently engaged in consultation and 2 more that have received a notice of intent. Our takeaway from this slide is that the NFIP and compliance with the ESA is not going away. We are watching the paradigm shift. Also, the red is showing the communities that do not participate in the NFIP. So how do we get here in the Puget Sound? This got started when FEMA was sued in 2003 for failing to comply with the ESA. A year later, the court ruled that FEMA needed to consult with NIMS through a federal agency-to-federal agency process. As part of this process, FEMA created a biological evaluation of our program, the NFIP. NIMS did not entirely agree with the findings of that document, and in 2008 issued their biological opinion on the implementation of the NFIP in Puget Sound, what we all know as the BIOP. In this document, they concluded the NFIP jeopardized the continued existence and recovery of species they are charged with managing and recovering. In this sense, jeopardy means an action which reasonably would be expected to directly or indirectly reduce appreciably the likelihood of survival and recovery of a listed species, or results in the destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat that these species rely on for their survival and reproduction. Part of the BIOP is a reasonable and prudent alternative, or RPA, which describes actions or revisions NIMS determined are necessary so implementation of the NFIP in the Sound does not jeopardize the continued existence of these species. Then, FEMA was sued again in 2011 for failing to implement the RPA, and in 2014, the judge sided with FEMA, and here we are today. What species specifically are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about Chinook, steelhead, Hood Canal summer run chum, and the southern resident killer whale, or orca. Orca are included because if the salmon and steelhead are not available as prey, the orca will likely never be recovered. This BIOP and RPA do not pertain to the entire state. Rather, they only affect areas that drain into the Puget Sound. The map here depicts main waterways that drain into the Sound and the 122 NFIP participating communities that are part of the Puget Sound watershed and impacted by this BIOP. In order to implement the RPA, FEMA Region 10 devised 3 main options, or doors, that a community may choose. Door 1 entails adopting a model ordinance that FEMA Region 10 and the state of Washington created. Admittedly, this is a one-size-fits-all approach, and we know that one size, in fact, does not often fit most. That's why there's Door 2. This option allows local jurisdictions to show how their existing ordinances, or proposed revisions to their ordinances, achieves or exceeds the same protective standards the RPA asks for. As an alternative to those 2 programmatic approaches, the third option, or Door 3, allows a community to evaluate each individual project for compliance with the RPA. DOR 1, the model ordinance, combines structural-based floodplain management standards with requirements that protect floodplain functions. You may note this approach is relative to floodplain functions these listed species rely on for survival and reproduction, and not the specific primary constituent elements or identified essential fish habitat. The RPA in general takes this function-based approach. DOR 2 is a very community-specific option, as community regulations can be quite unique. This is an iterative process between FEMA Region 10 and the community, and to initiate this process, a community completes a crosswalk document that Region 10 developed and describes how their ordinance language achieves the needed protective standards. The crosswalk is a tool that compares standards in the community's ordinance to those in the model ordinance. As with DOR 1, this is relative to floodplain functions and not species-specific. In other words, if a community enforces an ordinance that adequately protects floodplain functions and values these species depend on to survive and reproduce, then development activities in that community's floodplain will not adversely affect these species. Even for DOR 1 or DOR 2 communities, it's possible that a project just doesn't fit into the sometimes rigid ordinance language, which is based on the standards found in Appendix 4 of the BIOP. If a project just doesn't fit this method of showing compliance, a community still has the option to require a habitat assessment to address a specific project's impacts. This brings us to the DOR 3, or permit-by-permit option, of complying with the RPA. This option requires an adequate habitat assessment for nearly all projects in the SFHA. Under this option, the applicant or project proponent must have an assessment completed that describes and analyzes all impacts of the proposed development on floodplain functions and processes that support ESA-listed species. This approach can be difficult in part because it is applying a permit-by-permit review in order to achieve programmatic compliance, and we're going to talk more about how to address those challenges. Also, communities that use this option do not need to revisit a permit that has already been deemed entirely ESA compliant via other means. The BIOP lists activities that can occur without the need for a habitat assessment. If a project does not fall entirely within an assessment exemption, an assessment is required. In order for a project to be approvable, there must be no adverse impacts to floodplain functions that support those species. In other words, the effects determination must either be no effect or may affect but not likely to adversely affect. And this is the infamous fish math slide. When we have fish and functioning habitat that has not been detrimentally altered, we have happy, thriving, and reproducing fish. When we have fish and destroy habitat and functions they depend on, we get unhappy fish, meaning dead fish, because they were swept out to the sound too soon and eaten or otherwise unable to reproduce. And while the slide is lighthearted, the message is very important and serious. Habitat assessments must show the fish math. A conclusion that is not clearly supported by a logic track and analysis in the report is not sufficient. So the takeaway here is to make sure these reports show the math, or logic, used to get to the determination. So who actually reviews and approves the assessments? Who approves the development permit? Here's a hint. FEMA has no land use authority and does not approve any land use permits or development. Land use is a local issue, and that is where the review, approval, and denial authority lies. So, the local jurisdiction, the tribe, city, or county, that is responsible for issuing the floodplain development permit is the entity that reviews and approves, denies, or requests additional information for the proposal and associated habitat assessment. That means it is the local community that ensures assessments adequately analyze all pertinent impacts of the proposal on existing floodplain functions while also carefully considering cumulative impacts. Also, they ensure the appropriate action area is being considered, which almost always extends well beyond the subject property. And if the assessment does not give the community enough analysis to support the conclusion, it's the community's responsibility to either deny the permit or request additional information until it is shown the project does not result in adverse impacts to floodplain functions that support these ESA-listed species. As we mentioned, the RPA lists some occasions when a habitat assessment is not required. If the action or project has already been deemed ESA compliant through other means, like a Core 404 permit or a non-conversion forest practice activity, then there's no reason to redo that work or revisit that agreement. The community would just need to document that the entirety of the project in the SFHA was already reviewed and deemed ESA compliant. This has an important caveat. If only part of the project in the SFHA was reviewed under that other process, then that portion of the project in the SFHA that was not previously considered would need a habitat assessment to ensure the whole project in the SFHA is compliant with the RPA. Same thing if a project falls under an existing assessment, like a phase project where an assessment was already performed on the entire project. We aren't interested in making work for the sake of work. We just need to document that projects are consistent with the ESA and don't harm these species. Please remember, documentation in a flood hazard permit file is critical to explain why a project was approved and a permit was issued. This documentation also comes into play during a community assistance visit, or CAV, because FEMA and the state will be asking for the assessment or documentation showing the project is compliant with the RPA. This is part of FEMA's role, making sure the NFIP is being implemented consistent with the regulations. Here is a list of specific activities that do not need a habitat assessment. These are also listed in various places in the RPA. If a community has a programmatic approach to compliance with the RPA, those Door 1 and 2 communities, they only need to require habitat assessments for unusual or complex projects that don't fit in their ordinance framework. That's the whole point of a programmatic approach, having certainty about what the requirements are and not requiring habitat assessments for every project in the SFHA.
Now let's move on to more details about the RPA. One very important item: everything we talk about and have been talking about applies only to areas that are within the special flood hazard area. And I'll be repeating that because it's a very fundamental point for everything related to the BIOP, the RPA, and the NFIP. The NFIP does not set the interest rates or speed limits in the country and also does not have authority in areas that are outside the special flood hazard area. So anyway, areas that are very important for RPA implementation include the special flood hazard area, the floodway, the channel migration zone, and the riparian buffer zone. And yes, if there is anything that uses more than 2 words, we will have an acronym for it. The special flood hazard area is the area subject to flooding by the 1% chance flood event, or base flood, or sometimes called the 100-year flood event. You may notice that you can barely see the words 100-year, and that's not an accident. Like we said earlier, we feel that label misrepresents the level of risk in this area. Every year, there is a 1% chance of a flood of this magnitude or larger occurring. It does not mean that floods happen once every 100 years, as some people mistakenly think. Anyway, the special flood hazard area is made up of the floodway and the flood fringe. There is also an area called the protected area, which is a subset of the special flood hazard area. Because once again, everything we talk about today is within the special flood hazard area. The protected area comprises the larger of the floodway, the channel migration zone, and the riparian buffer zone. And the protected area is also always within the special flood hazard area and never extends beyond the limits of the special flood hazard area. So for example, if the riparian buffer zone, which is part of what makes up the protected area, extends out of the special flood hazard area on the map, it actually stops at the edge of the special flood hazard area for regulatory purposes because that is the limit of NFIP authority. Everything we're talking about for regulatory purposes is within the special flood hazard area. Everything. A FEMA floodway is an engineering construct and is not represented by any physical feature that you can see on the ground, except the floodway will always include the normal channel of the watercourse you're looking at. A floodway is a floodplain management tool intended to make it easier for local government to achieve one of the primary management goals under the NFIP. That is a goal of ensuring that base flood elevations, also called BFE, do not rise more than 1 foot at any location within their jurisdiction over time. This is a long-term management requirement measured in decades, not days or weeks. To determine the boundaries of the floodway, engineers use a computer model with data from multiple cross-sections of the special flood hazard area where development can be simulated and its effects on flood elevation calculated. The resulting tools show local floodplain managers the areas where development can occur without concern of violating their long-term management goal, so long as the floodway remains undeveloped and unaltered. You may notice on the graphic here that the floodway, the yellow area, is not relative to the ordinary high water mark or the riparian buffer zone, because a floodway is not something that you can see on the ground, and it can typically only be accurately determined by a surveyor. Here is a schematic of the floodway that helps explain how floodway boundaries are determined. The schematic is a cross-section of the floodplain as you might see at any cross-section line shown in any detailed study for a flood insurance rate map. You can see the floodplain has two parts, the flood fringe and the floodway. In the digital model, we simulate development as shown in brown. We begin filling at both banks and simultaneously work towards the center of the channel, filling on both sides by equal conveyance, not equal volume. When we reach a point where we have squeezed the river to the point that the water has risen 1 foot, as shown here labeled as surcharge, we stop filling and draw the boundary line for the floodway. Okay, now let's look at the riparian buffer zone, or RBZ. This is like our stream buffers, in that it encompasses the land next to the watercourses likely to support aquatic and riparian habitat. This area is important for the animals in these waterways. Here are the specific RBZs listed in the RPA, and like our stream buffers, are measured perpendicular from the ordinary high water mark. And you might be thinking these don't pertain to your jurisdiction because you just went through a CAO, or Critical Areas Ordinance, update that was approved by Ecology, and your buffers were found to be acceptable. Well, unfortunately, this is not the case. These buffers have no relation to CAO stream buffers, and these buyout buffers still apply as it relates to the National Flood Insurance Program only. However, these ramifications of this RBZ are different from our CAOs here in Washington, and we'll get into that more. The message here is that there is an RBZ that is likely different from your stream buffers and shoreline jurisdiction, so we can't solely rely on those regulations to protect the RBZ as defined in the RPA. Also remember, the riparian buffer zone can never extend beyond the special flood hazard area for NFIP regulatory purposes. A channel migration zone, CMZ, is just that, areas at risk to channel movement given what is known about the watercourse, soils, etc. The CMZ is not a part of a flood insurance rate map or FERM and is typically not mapped by FEMA. However, if a community asks, the Risk Analysis Branch at FEMA Region 10 can assist communities to identify risks and could potentially help produce a CMZ map at the community's request. That info would be used however the community wishes, like for zoning, long-range planning efforts, etc.
The protected area is a subset of the SFHA and consists of the largest extent of the floodway, CMZ, and RBZ, meaning whatever combination of those three areas results in the largest area and most protection, that's the protected area. Okay, so why do we care about this protected area? Well, the RPA states that the protected area is a no disturbance zone, except for those activities that do not adversely affect floodplain functions. It also states that mitigation is not an option for projects in the protected area. This means that proposals must be inherently designed to avoid adverse impacts. If you come from a land use background, this idea of no mitigation seems strange, but stick with me here while I explain. Projects in the protected area can't use mitigation. However, a proposal can include project design elements to improve floodplain functions, values, and processes so the project is not likely to adversely affect ESA-listed species. You might be thinking, well, that sounds an awful lot like mitigation to me. You also might be thinking this is just a semantic stance. What NIMS was trying to get at here is a few different things. First, They want the consideration of floodplain functions to happen during the very initial stages of development planning, instead of it being an afterthought enforced. Another point NIMS had with this is mitigation means different things to different people. For example, both pictures here can be considered mitigation. The left picture could be compensating or offsetting for negative impacts from some project, compensatory mitigation. The other picture of the sediment pond is also a form of mitigation, but is quite different from the other picture. That sediment pond is mitigating impacts by reducing the amount of sediment entering a stream, but a lot of sediment could still get to that stream. As a colleague of ours says, mitigation can be making bad a little less bad. So that's another reason why NIMS says no mitigation in the protected area. So let's talk more about the protected area, how to determine its extent and why it matters. This slide can serve as a key for the next four. So the red denotes the SFHA, that orange line is the CMZ, and that line includes the 50-foot buffer. Green is the RBZ, and yellow is the floodway. And we also know the protected area is the largest extent of the CMZ, RBZ, and floodway to the extent it is within the SFHA. We can see at the very bottom of this slide that the protected area there, at the very bottom of the picture, is from CMZ to CMZ because that is the largest extent of the CMZ, RBZ, and floodway in that area. We care about the protected area because that is the area that's most important to these species. Projects in this area warrant a high level of scrutiny, and there is also the RPA requirement that the projects in the protected area do not use mitigation. So now we're going to go through and determine the extent of the protected area in these three locations marked here with a question mark. For the first, uppermost transect, what is the extent of the protected area? Where does the protected area end on the left? The CMZ, and yes, that line includes the 50-foot buffer. What about the right side? The SFHA. So for that top transect, the extent of the protected area goes from the CMZ plus 50 feet on the left to the SFHA on the right. Please note, the right-hand extent does not go to the CMZ because that's outside of the SFHA, and nothing we're going to talk about will extend beyond the SFHA. Now, the middle transect, and this is a little tricky because the colors here are hard to see, but there's a floodway behind the green RBZ, and you should note the floodway is always within the SFHA. Anyway, the left-hand limit of the protected area would be the floodway, because that's also the limits of the SFHA there. And the right-hand extent is the CMZ plus 50 feet. And now for the last transect on the bottom. The left-hand extent of the protected area is the CMZ plus 50 feet, and the right-hand extent is the floodway. So that's how to determine the extent of the protected area. So that all makes enough sense in rivering systems, but what about for areas on the coast or on a lake? For lakes, the protected area is the RBZ, which would be 150 feet from the ordinary high water mark, unless floodways or CMZs are applicable. For a strictly coastal floodplain, the protected area is the RBZ, which would be 200 feet from ordinary high water mark, because floodways and CMZs, again, are not applicable. This is just a reminder that the Puget Sound BIOP or RPA requirements are separate from and in addition to your other regulations for shorelines and critical areas. These RPA standards we're talking about today have no relation to other environmental laws. Per the RPA, there can be no short or long-term adverse effects to ESA-listed species or their designated critical habitats within the floodway, riparian buffer zone, RBZ, or channel migration zone, CMZ, the protected area. Also, adverse impacts can't be minimized, rectified, or mitigated because there can't be any adverse impacts. I know we've said this, but it warrants repeating. The protected area is a no disturbance zone except for those activities that will not adversely affect habitat functions. So any use that would adversely affect floodplain functions cannot be allowed. Again, projects must be inherently designed to avoid adverse impacts. These projects can include project design features and elements that improve floodplain functions that support these species. While that may sound a lot like compensatory mitigation, it's also different. NIMS is getting at the need to plan projects in these sensitive areas to consider impacts to floodplain functions at the very initial stages of project design and not at the end after a proponent has already heavily invested in a design. And now a little bit of a kicker. If a community has not mapped the CMZ for a river, the protected area standards then apply to the entire SFHA. So for riverine floodplains, that makes the protected area the entire SFHA. If the project is out of the protected area, habitat assessments are still required, and we use standard mitigation sequencing that's briefly described in the next slide, and the project can use compensatory mitigation. When applying and documenting the sequencing, projects in the SFHA need to describe how all reasonable measures were taken to avoid floodplain habitat impacts. Then there needs to be information about how the project minimized all impacts to the extent practicable that could not be avoided. Now let's get into compensatory mitigation. Any and all adverse impacts to floodplain functions that support these species must be entirely offset. This can occur by replacing features and functions that may be impaired and/or provide other compensatory mitigation that wholly offsets or rectifies all adverse effects that would otherwise detrimentally impact listed species. I hope this is common sense, but any mitigation must benefit the same species and populations affected by the proposed development. You can't harm salmon and then compensate by doing something good for a marbled murrelet. And now let's switch gears and talk about what should be included in these habitat assessments as it's related to floodplain functions. It's important to recognize that each project has unique circumstances and additional considerations may be prudent for some projects. That said, what we'll be talking about is really what should be minimally included in an assessment. These assessments should be organized very similar to how we write other environmental reports for wetlands, streams, etc. Generally, there needs to be a discussion about the project area, the habitat and functions the project area can offer, and a sufficient description of the project. Then, there needs to be an analysis of the impacts to specific floodplain functions. This is arguably the most important part of any assessment and what we're referring to when we say the fish math needs to be shown. In other words, the logic path and analysis used to support the conclusions and determinations must be provided. The area an assessment considers can be called the action area. Historically, biological reports often limit the action area to the subject property, adjacent lands, or a certain radius, like a half mile from the project site. The action area is defined as all areas to be affected directly or indirectly by the proposal and not merely the immediate area involved in the action. For our purposes, the area that can be impacted directly or indirectly by a project is almost always going to include, at a minimum, the subject property, surrounding area, and those lands downstream and within the SFHA. This makes sense because things that happen on a riverine system have the potential to affect all downstream neighbors. There is also the potential for some projects to cause backwater or impound floodwaters. This could cause upstream impacts. So the action area to be analyzed in these habitat assessments must include the spatial extent of all direct, indirect, interrelated, and interdependent effects of the project. Now, the next 3 slides list floodplain functions and values that should typically be analyzed in every single assessment and documented in the floodplain development permit, which would be needed in CAVs to show compliance with the BIOP. Habitat assessments need to show, through analysis, the project will result in no adverse effects to water quantity and quality. This analysis needs to consider temperature, groundwater changes, and impacts from new impervious surfaces. Stormwater management should be designed to reach the water body with the same frequency, timing, and duration compared to if the project does not happen, and the pre-development water pattern, quantity, and quality should be maintained or mimicked. There should also be specific information included to show the project will not result in an increase to flood velocities or volumes. Flood storage capacity is a big-ticket item and something that's often not fully analyzed. Flood velocities, volumes, and elevations must not be increased, especially when considering cumulative impacts. This is a very important takeaway: cumulative impacts. Remember, we're using a permit-by-permit approach to address the implementation of a program, So if we neglect to address the cumulative impacts that could result from other projects occurring like what's being considered by a given assessment, then we are missing the mark. People say this cumulative analysis is difficult, and I completely agree. This, in particular, is part of what makes Door 3 difficult. Accurately analyzing all impacts, especially cumulative impacts. So anyway, any compensatory flood storage mitigation or design elements must be appropriate and comparable to the baseline conditions with respect to ground elevations, floodplain connectivity, fish access and not stranding, general habitat, and refuge, so that the compensatory storage is clearly designed to function like the storage area that will be lost. And remember, the overarching standard is no adverse impacts to floodplain functions that support these species. We also need to specifically address riparian vegetation and habitat forming processes. Processes are also a big deal because if a project eliminates the potential for a habitat forming process to occur, such as the recruitment of large woody debris or spawning substrate, that project would have an adverse impact on these species. Assessments need to also specifically consider refuge, where fishes would go to get out of the high velocity floodwaters, which is critically important to their survival, along with spawning substrate. And the reports need to be specifically addressing indirect impacts, which can be a very big deal when we're talking about water, and analyze what the impacts would be if similar properties were similarly developed, those cumulative impacts. And again, if we're not addressing all direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, we're not meeting the standards. You may have noticed that a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of geared towards riverine systems. For coastal and lacustrine systems, flood storage may not be an issue as it relates to increasing flood velocities. For these, we can't just not address things in the assessment. If the nature of the subject floodplain is such that there is no potential to impact certain functions and values, then the report should describe and provide the supporting logic and analysis for that conclusion. And of course, specifically consider cumulative effects. Here is a list of some of the most common damaging modifications that we need to pay close attention to. Bank armoring, channel straightening, isolating floodplain habitat from the watercourse and such can impact the ability of the floodplain to moderate flooding, retain floodwaters, reduce erosion and sedimentation, provide habitat and refuge, and it can eliminate the potential for important habitat forming processes to occur. Reducing the flood storage capacity through importing fill or due to structures can create a system that has higher flood flow velocities, more erosive flows, poorer water quality, or cause less refuge to be available. We need to make sure development does not result in degraded water quality or increase in the delivery of sediments. This can be done in part by proper stormwater management using low-impact development techniques. The next one is a bit of a mouthful. Reductions in the discharge of low summer base flows or the increase in the duration or reoccurrence of low summer base flows is a problem for obvious reasons. And again, improper stormwater management can cause this, along with, for example, a curtain drain that intercepts groundwater and tightlines that water either to the watercourse or to a stormwater system. We need to make sure we're maintaining and mimicking the groundwater inputs and flow patterns. Also, the removal of riparian vegetation can negatively impact water quality, increase temperature, remove detrital input, insects and prey availability, and habitat forming processes, to name a few. And as we previously noted, the removal of noxious weeds is okay without a habitat assessment and is actually encouraged. And now, let's move on to the effects determination that we need in these assessments. We expect these assessments to come to a conclusion based on provided analysis on whether impacts to these species will be beneficial, discountable, insignificant, or detrimental. And all these words have a specific definition. Beneficial means wholly positive with no negative components. Discountable effects are those that are extremely unlikely to occur and relate to the frequency of the effect. An event could be discountable because it is extremely unlikely based on the timing. Insignificant effects relate to the size or magnitude of the impact, so a person would not be able to meaningfully measure an insignificant effect, and detrimental impacts negatively impact these species. A few things to keep in mind. Essential features do not have to be present at the time of the project to be affected, as some are seasonal or temporary or the product of natural processes. And it's important to maintain the ability for these processes to occur. An action that would interrupt the natural development or occurrence of habitat-forming processes is adversely affecting these species. Now for the effect determination, which needs to consider all direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of the proposal, as well as the effects that are interrelated and interdependent. These are generally going to be no effect, may affect but not likely to adversely affect, or may affect and likely to adversely affect. Now let's talk about these. No effect is a very high bar to meet, and this is the correct determination if there is no way on this green earth that these species can feel an impact from the project. And I mean no way. At all. In fact, why are we even talking about it? Generally, this determination should be very rare when we're talking about putting something new in the SFHA. No effect means exactly that. Absolutely no impacts whatsoever, at all, no way, ain't gonna happen, so why are we still talking about this? This kind of project could include interior wiring or replacing windows. The way I tend to look at this is if I need to think about it very hard, it's not a no effect. And an insignificant or negligible impact is not the same as no impact. Even restoration projects do not meet this standard. Some people have told me that this interpretation is far too rigid. However, this information is consistent with NIMS, who is the ESA expert, so this is the standard FEMA is using. And now, what should be the far more common determination for properly designed projects in the SFHA. May affect, but not likely to adversely affect, is the appropriate conclusion when all effects are beneficial, insignificant, or discountable. This determination is not made on the net effects of the action, meaning that if there is an adverse impact at any point in time, the project cannot be considered not likely to adversely affect, because there being adverse impact. A may affect but not likely to adversely affect determination would not be appropriate if there would be any adverse impacts to an individual of an ESA-listed species, whether interim or short-term, regardless of any beneficial conservation measures or mitigation activities. And if the project is likely to adversely affect ESA-listed species, give us and/or NIMS a call and we'll get a path forward.
And now we're on the home stretch of this webinar. Let's talk about some guidance and sources of additional information to help with these complex issues. FEMA Region 10 has some guidance documents that people can all reference, all of which are available online. Use your favorite search engine and search for the key phrase FEMA Region 10 and ESA. I think our Washington ESA page is the second link that will pop up, if not the first. Anyway, here are 3 guidance documents that are available. The left document is information on how to get points in the community rating system for habitat protection. The right document is engineering information and how some studies should be performed to meet RPA standards. The middle document is guidance on writing a habitat assessment and mitigation report. This document is intended to be applicable to the most complicated projects, but it can be simplified for less complicated projects. People often ask how complicated the habitat assessment needs to be. The answer is commensurate to the complexity of the project. So a complicated project would likely necessitate a complicated assessment, and a simple project could likely have a relatively simple habitat assessment. The following frequently asked question documents are also available on the FEMA Region 10 website. We've received feedback that the 2013 Floodplain Habitat Assessment Mitigation document is just too complicated and unwieldy for many projects. So Region 10 tried a different approach and recently created a new worksheet that is still a work in progress, but something that we hope can help nail down what should be minimally included in these assessments, the big ticket items that really need to be analyzed. This worksheet document was intended to be similar to the NFIP, meaning that it has items that should be in a report at a minimum. Originally, this was designed to be used by the people implementing the NFIP and RPA and reviewing assessments, but we also realized this could be helpful for the people that are writing the assessments as well. And like the NFIP, local communities can have higher standards or require information in addition to what the worksheet says. But if an assessment does not contain logic relative to all the points in the worksheet, I would likely be asking for that information before approval if I were working in the local jurisdiction. And as I said, it is a different approach compared to the 2013 document. But both approaches are valid. We were just trying something different to see if it would be helpful. The worksheet is broken up into a few main sections listed here. And remember that whatever the community requires is what is required. But it should not be less than the items listed on the worksheet. The worksheet is organized into a few main sections, such as those projects that can be exempted from an assessment, general standards for all special flood hazard area development, followed by specific functions that should be considered and analyzed. It then goes on to discuss standards for projects inside the protected area and those outside the protected area. All of this information came straight out of the RPA, and we hope that it helps people understand the requirements and implement the RPA. Please note this document is a work in progress and is just a tool to help implementation and compliance. If you have feedback about this tool, please let us know so that we may improve it. There are also these two documents that can help provide a methodology to justify a decision or proposal for armoring. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife issued the Marine Shorelines Design Guidelines, the MSDG, and Integrated Stream Bank Protection Guidelines that walks through the thought process for bank protection, which is like sequencing that we are used to now. But the important thing here is that NIMFS is okay with projects that follow and document the methodology consistent with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife documents. A letter of map change is a way a landowner or community can tell FEMA to correct the flood insurance rate map because a project was constructed that the local jurisdiction permitted, and the project changed the flooding risk. There is one line on this form that requires the community signature. This signature shows FEMA that the project meets all local requirements and the requirements of the RPA. The project was already permitted, so FEMA needs to be sure that it was compliant with the RPA and local codes. This issue comes up when communities feel uneasy signing the letter of map change or wonder what they need to show for ESA RPA compliance. Region 10 believes the habitat assessment section of the worksheet can also be applied here to help communities, biologists, and landowners know what, at a minimum, should be included.
Now, this probably won't surprise you, but this program and implementing the RPA has its fair share of challenges. People have said, you only care about the fishes and you don't care about me or my family, and that's just not the case. And these standards do not put fish against life safety. These concepts are not mutually exclusive. This isn't a fish versus flood conversation, but rather a fish and flood. Development actions that consider floodplain functions are typically good for risk management too. Remember, the NFIP, to include FEMA, has no land use authority. This power lies with the local community. We are dealing with multiple, sometimes competing regulations. We're trying to streamline things, but this is certainly a challenge. Local community codes and ordinances are all very unique, and the region works with communities to see how the RPA relates to their specific circumstances. Lastly, if you've worked in land use for any length of time, you've probably heard somebody say, I've been developing for 40 years and I've never had to deal with this before. Well, times are changing. We've mentioned that we are smack dab in the middle of a paradigm shift, and while people may not have had to deal with this before, they do now. So for the path forward, Region 10 will increase our outreach and workshop efforts. For the last couple of years, we've been holding about 6 workshops per year and will continue to have workshops until people stop attending. We will continue to refine and make clarifications, guidance materials, and offer technical assistance. We are working closer with all levels of government and the private sector. For example, we've started inviting biological consultants to attend these workshops. The people who are writing these assessments should have the opportunity to see what the standards are and take part in these conversations. Given they generally get involved in a project before permits are applied for, these professionals have a unique ability to influence project design. And of course, if habitat assessments are written well, it will make life easier for our local permitting partners too. And in April 2016, FEMA received the Oregon Biological Opinion and RPA from NIMFS as a result of separate litigation. The Oregon BiOp and RPA is somewhat similar to the Puget Sound BiOp and RPA, but it's also different. FEMA headquarters is also in the process of completing a national environmental impact statement for the NFIP and is working on developing national standards for ESA compliance. This is, after all, the National Flood Insurance Program, and the region sees a need and benefit in providing guidance and outreach until we all understand this complicated issue. Community compliance with the BIOP is assessed during Community Assistance Visits, the CAVs. This is part of why we tell communities to document decisions in their permit file, because it is our job to ensure the NFIP is being implemented correctly, and the NFIP requires all supporting documentation to be maintained in the permit file, so FEMA, NIMS, the state, or whoever can see why a decision was made. When a CAV is performed, we look at all these documents used to support permitting decisions. A central message that we feel is very important is that land use and flood management practices that consider ESA-listed species and their critical habitat is good floodplain management, because it reduces flood damages and benefits all. Yes, it's different from how a lot of development occurred in the past, but we are moving forward and we firmly believe these management practices are mutually beneficial. You can access guidance materials on the FEMA Region 10 website and contact us with questions or comments. The email address here goes to both of us. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the webinar.
We sincerely thank you for your participation and partnership as we move forward in this process and look forward to working with you. Thank you.